let's jump in. And I think a good place to start is who's Karia Samaroo? Maybe fill the audience in on, more about yourself and your background.
Sure. So as of now, I'm an entrepreneur and primarily working in the tech industry, fintech specifically. But I started out actually as a lawyer and really was drawn to corporate finance and M&A ever since I was back in law school. There was something that kind of drew me in that direction. So I started my career as a lawyer working at a big law firm in Calgary, and that meant I was working with a lot of oil and gas companies. And I thought that's what I wanted at the time. It was, sort of the dream for everybody coming out of law school was to work for one of those big firms. And I think after a while, spending so much of my time and energy helping oil and gas companies raise money to drill really just kind of I was like, what am I doing? Like this doesn't really align with with where I want to be and what interests me. And we had so there was a downturn in oil and gas, and our firm started to work with or try and work with more technology companies and startups. And I have this really vivid memory of this entrepreneur coming in to meet with me and one of our partners. And the partner was somebody who had only ever worked with Shell and Husky and these massive, companies that are worth, $100 billion. And this entrepreneur was a power lifter. He actually held the world record for the biggest bicep curl. and and he had this big vision for this app he wanted to build for training. And I just remember sitting in the room with him and this law firm partner and seeing how uncomfortable the partner was talking with this guy about his vision and how he wanted to bring it to life. And I felt like that's the first time that I kind of really felt at home in a law firm setting, because I was able to, I guess, see that vision and really kind of share in the excitement that this guy had behind what he was trying to build. And so that was kind of one of those first moments where I'm like, oh, maybe I'm just working in the wrong kind of sector. So I moved to Vancouver shortly after that just to get closer to tech. And the timing was 2016. I heard a lot of people talking about Bitcoin, and I was still a lawyer at the time, but I used that really as a way to get into that space. So that securities background and corporate finance background just tied into a lot of what was happening in crypto at the time. And I just got connected with some great people, some of the early founders in that industry, and it felt really high risk at the time because not a lot of lawyers were advising in the crypto space, but it was really rewarding. I learned a lot, and that kind of took me to this transition of leaving private practice, leaving law, and getting involved in the business side of some stuff in that industry.
Can you fill me in a little bit? So 2016, this is pre 2017, 2016, 2017, crypto starts to rise like crazy. You come in 2016. What were you doing then? And what are you doing today as it relates to the crypto space?
Sure. So yeah, I can catch you up from there. So 2016, I got really interested because I was reading about ICOs, and I was wondering, hey, I spent the first 5 years of my career advising companies on raising money, and now there's this brand new way to raise money that people are doing in a really significant way in a very short periods of time. We would spend, when I was working at a law firm, you would spend a month or 2 months doing a deal for Shell to raise money to, do an acquisition or something like that. And then what I was seeing in the crypto space was people were raising that amount of money in a day or less. And so I was just really fascinated by that. And so getting involved at that time, I actually advised one of the very first ICOs that happened in Canada. And it was, again, really rewarding. It felt really just brand new. And that taking on that risk led to an opportunity to start a crypto advisory firm with a few partners that I had met in Vancouver, and that was really an amazing experience, getting to kind of be involved with advising some of the some of the really early adoption from like enterprise into crypto. So like it was at that time in 2017 where everybody was getting in. So we were, dealing with multinational companies that were wanting to understand crypto more and figure out, can we do a token and all these things. So um, that firm that we started, we sold it to Mike Novogratz and Galaxy Digital in 2018, and that was part of the first publicly listed crypto company, which is now Galaxy Digital, and they've gone on to do great things. But it was really kind of taking some early risks where I was getting a lot of, there seems to be a theme throughout my career, which is people asking me like, what the hell are you doing? And I feel like now I have learned that that's actually a guidepost for I'm actually going in the right direction. But that was one of those early ones, and I hadn't learned that lesson yet, so I was losing a lot of sleep at the time. But yeah, have progressed on from there. And since then, I took a break from crypto after that, and I actually got into aviation, which is a personal passion of mine. So I met a guy who had just bought a small charter airline in Canada, and he had this vision for converting it to an ultra low cost carrier because Canada didn't have one at the time. And he had seen this model, work in so many different places, and we just kind of hit it off. And so I got involved with them at a very early stage, and that company is Flair Airlines. And so when I joined, he had just purchased the airline. There was no funding in place. They had this really small fleet, and yeah, he had this kind of big vision. So got to see Flair go through getting funded by a private equity firm, growing their fleet, like quadrupling their fleet, expanding through North America, and now they actually have, I think, over 10% of market share in Canada, which is really kind of incredible. But yeah, that was another kind of I guess deviation from what might seem like a natural path to continue on, but just felt like something that I was really drawn to and passionate about at the time.
Fascinating. And you were the GC and chief customer officer there, I believe, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
involved, I mean, it was, I would say I thought crypto was the most crazy thing that I would ever see, but aviation is a whole different world. There's a lot of, there's a lot that goes on there that I think the average customer doesn't know, but, especially in kind of like an upstart type of environment. But I think that's really what drew me into that, is kind of being part of something early like that. And then when I moved on from working with them and got back in, I was just getting pulled back into, you're obviously intimately familiar with the cycles of crypto. So things started to kind of come back, and I was getting pulled into a lot of different kind of advisory roles in the space, particularly in Canada. And I think at one stage, I think I was advising almost every crypto company in Canada in one way, shape, or form. And then I sort of had a conversation with myself about, what would this look like if I put all of my effort into starting my own thing, which I have done before in different capacities, but have always been, I'd say, quite like spread across different ventures. And so that decision to focus on one thing is what started WonderFi.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Which today you're the chairman of the board, but you founded that company, you were the CEO of that company. Today that company is publicly listed, correct? On the TSX.
Yes, it's publicly listed on the TSX, and it's the largest crypto trading platform in Canada. Just crossed over 2 million users, and I think they put out a press release today that's I think the assets under custody are about 1.5 billion Canadian, and so it's amazing to see that come to life, and seeing where it's at today. I'm really proud of.
Amazing. Amazing. So you've transitioned from big law and securities and oil and gas to executive leadership to founding companies to sitting on, the boards of companies and advising entrepreneurs. Are there any main takeaways, or can you share what these transitions have taught you about being resilient, being adaptable in the fast-paced world of technology? I mean, I did hear you kind of say like, hey, that you had to take some risk at various times and kind of had to be bold in your decision making. But I don't know, what have you learned from all that?
Yeah, I think transition's different for everyone. I guess for me, it has always come with this theme of working extremely hard and putting everything into getting into a certain position or seeing something come to fruition. And so, like for example, I had this dream of working at this big law firm, and I worked so hard to get into that. And then the transition that came from that was really looking at what my life was and seeing like, is this really what I want? And so it's like building up to those milestones and then just kind of like peeling everything back, leaving everything behind and starting something new. And I think that's something that a lot of people face. I, I I remember really vividly, and I have this also played out through, talking with people that are facing similar transitions now, but had this really vivid memory of this feeling that my next move needs to be my forever move or a perfect move, and I think that's a place where a lot of people get stuck. And what I learned then, and I've seen through all these different transitions in my career, is it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be in the right direction. And I think that's something that that a lot of people really get stuck on.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I think a lot of folks think if they're making a move, whether that's to starting their own company
Mhm.
or to flipping over to the investor side or joining a
Mhm.
different company or whatever it is, um, there's this pressure to find home forever, and it's a
Mhm.
nice thought,
Yeah.
but I think, I mean, life is long, your career is long,
Mhm.
and if you're just continuously moving in the long direction, in the right direction, and if you have a long-term
Mhm.
point of view, um, I think that's helpful. So,
Yeah, for sure. I couldn't agree more. And I think the other thing that I've learned through transitions is that, and I think that again different for everybody, but just for me, exploring really requires a lot of patience. And I think that for lots of people, whether it's switching professions or quitting your job or walking away from a sure thing, like there's this theme that I feel like is coming up, especially, probably more now than ever. And I think when you know that you don't know what the destination is, but you know that what you're leaving isn't for you, and that brings on this exploration phase, which I think is, some people might never have that in their career, some people might have that once, and then some people might have that, multiple times. And I think that um, being able to be patient with that process and understand also that those exploration stages, they can be challenging because they don't have these, quantitative markers that other parts of our career do. And so I think it can be easy to be hard on yourself about like, oh, it doesn't feel like I'm making progress. And I even have, friends and mentors and things like that that I've talked to that will try and create these quantitative metrics around their exploration phase, like, oh, I need to have this many meetings, or I need to, do this many things. And I think, everybody's got their own method, but at the end of the day, it's like, it's something that's really hard to quantify, especially when you're walking away from something that really has that.
yeah. So you've worked with many other talented leaders and individuals who've experienced transitions from whether it's their own companies to other companies, executive leaders you've worked in the past and transitioning to new companies? Is there a common theme or learning that you take from seeing them go through that exploration phase? And what you just said is really interesting. I think, yeah, some people are more data driven and
Hmm.
process oriented
Hmm.
through that transition. And some just need to slow it down a little bit and think
Hmm.
and,
Yeah.
go do what they like to do and meditate or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And slowly it comes to them which direction they want to head in. But anyways,
No, I love
yeah,
that. I think that's a really good way to put it. And I think, you know better than anyone, people have, there's so many different types of personalities. And I think like categorizing those sometimes can be helpful. But when you say, yeah, some people need that structure and some people need that kind of openness and just to go and live life. And I like to kind of, well, I'm a huge music fan and I, follow a lot of stories of my favorite musicians. And I think that at least for entrepreneurs, like more on the founder side, I think there's a lot of similarities where, you know, musicians and artists, like you need to live life to be able to create something. And so I think a mindset that a lot of entrepreneurs and founders can fall into, and I've done that as well, is not living the life, like not living the life and like letting yourself kind of have those experiences and go out and be in the world, because I think that you hold yourself to a high standard and you want to get the next thing going right away. But I think that it's those life experiences that inspire and bring new ideas that will often lead to what's next for you.
it's interesting because someone like yourself who obviously wants to push the envelope and wants to build great things and has been successful and will be successful. Um, yeah, I think there's this misconception that you have to just keep stepping in,
Hmm.
make this stepping stone, very process oriented, but sometimes you need that creative space.
Absolutely, and I feel like that's such a great point, and being able to like create space for that, I think, is what's key. Um, it can be hard to do that, I think, but being able to create that space can open up so many opportunities that I think we don't often see. Following what you're passionate about is the direction, and quite often people don't do that, and the outcomes are fine, but it's basically like what I keep seeing time and time again is um, people try to do things to be relevant, and then but their passion's going to eventually like pull them out of that. And so I think that being able to kind of get in tune with that can be really valuable. Not that it's the only way to go, but I just think there's a lot of value in that. And I think one other point that ties into that is no amount of money or success can keep you from what you really care deeply about. And I think that doesn't have to be a 0-1 thing, as in you let go of everything that's in your current world. But I think most entrepreneurs or people in business are on some sort of pursuit of finding their purpose and sort of fulfillment. And I think that is something that we often feel we need to quiet in order to be quote unquote successful. But I think that being able to lean into that is, that's where people find their superpower.
Karia, you've seen and advised, you know, early teams of technology companies, crypto blockchain companies. You've started companies of your own. In your experience, what are the key factors to consider when forming a founding team or an early team?
Great question. I think that, so I'm coming from probably a biased perspective where I'm really looking at from the very early ideation stage and what's the best way to bring that idea to life. And so I've gone through, hundreds, maybe yeah, maybe not thousands, but definitely hundreds of different ideas. And one thing that I think is crucial when you're a founder and seeking out that first partner is someone that can facilitate bringing that vision to life. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of people, people have different roles, I think, and skill sets, obviously, when you look at a founding team. And having someone that's overly critical early on, for example, as the first person that you sort of bring in, can really kill an idea and kill the potential of what that could become. And so I have a lot of examples or experience with just bringing it to the wrong person too early and seeing what that does to it. And I'm a big believer in, not just with startups, but just in life, with the concept that the first person that you share an idea with has the power to make or break it. And so I'm really kind of, that's something that I like to share with people, especially first time founders, because I think you're often looking to somebody with more experience or somebody with a different skill set, and you can take that as the gospel and say, like, oh well, this person built a successful company and they're telling me this isn't going to work, so I'm just going to, I'll just go, I'll throw it away. And I think that's, one of the worst things to do.
It's interesting. I actually love that. I you know, my operating business, Stacked SP, talent
Hmm.
firm for technology companies and venture-backed tech startups. As constantly as you build a business, and we're now a decade into this, but you're still ideating. And I like to think of it as starting small startups within a larger organization.
Mm.
But I think that's very true, that if you're quick to share, I mean, you need to share ideas because you need to hear feedback, you need to brainstorm, you need it to be almost messy at
Hmm.
first to come to something that uh, makes sense at the end of the day. But I think you're very right that if you share a startup idea or with a mentor or with someone, they do have the power in a way to, shut it down really quickly. An idea is very
Hmm.
fragile at the beginning,
Yes.
right?
Well
And
said.
sometimes it needs nurturing and it needs more exploration. So that's
Yes.
actually great advice.
That I
Yeah.
like the way that you recap that. That is so on point. And what I would add is, there's definitely a culture in the startup world of over validation also. So I think that I have seen and continue to see so many people that over validate ideas and then they never start anything. They never do anything. And I think that part of that is, you can truly find a reason to not do anything. If if you focus too much on all of these details around like what might go wrong or what might not work, as you're trying to validate your idea, like you're gonna kill it. And so I think that, especially at that early stage, like you said, things are so fragile, and at the end of the day, what you end up with is going to be completely different from what you start with. So I never understood why people spend so much time on validating that kind of like first concept. um, and then I guess, like, kind of as a segue into, not just like, because I feel like I'm kind of just dumping on, the logical and analytical people of the world, but there's obviously, they're essential, and the realists, I would say. But I think that there's the natural progression that, once you get past that ideation and you start to seek to bring things to life, as you grow, you do need more realists and more people that are analytical. And I think that's true for all startups. And it's also true as you go from being a startup to a more mature company. We saw that with WonderFi. You know, the amount of investors that you're dealing with changes, the sophistication of them, your board, you have more voices, and that really changes for a lot of companies. I think that changes your ability to innovate. Um, and so you get to a certain stage where there's so many different interests at play, and the company necessarily needs to become risk averse, or not necessarily, but that's where things go. And I think a lot of companies actually die that way through seeing the successful growth and then getting to kind of a stagnation phase. And I think the great ones can grow and bring on all those new pieces, but continue to innovate and find a way to do that. It's not easy.
Are there any specific qualities that you think of or that you would prioritize to ensure a strong and effective dynamic at the earliest stages of a startup?
Yeah, there's one quality that I care about the most, and it's you need doers more than anything. I think having people that do and just get things done, execute, try things. It's way more to me. It's way more important than experience, background, connections, all of that stuff. I think all that really means nothing if you just don't go out and do things. I'm definitely biased because I'm a speed guy. Like for me, speed is everything, and I'd rather go twice as fast and get it 65% right than go a lot slower and get it 90% right. That's just kind of my bias, I guess. But I think that that doer mentality is so crucial. And so many times I've seen people with way less experience and way less resources and way less connections go and do things a lot more meaningfully than somebody that has all of those things. And I think I think also I would just add, everyone's on their own journey, and I think in terms of looking at building a team, especially at that early stage, you can have somebody who's extremely it could be your dream person. You look and say, oh, this person built this company, did this, their skill set's perfect, they're, all these things, but their timing their timing on their journey might be different, and that might mean that they're not all in on what you're doing. And I think that timing piece is really key. So that took me a long time to understand, which is, well, no, of course, if I can get these people to be a part of my team or to be a part of the team, that's going to be the perfect recipe. But, right people, wrong timing, I think happens a lot. And I think that's a critical piece.
That's, yeah, right people, wrong timing. So true. There is and as you said, at the earliest stages, yeah, I mean, you really need people who have an orientation towards execution, getting things done, whatever it takes mentality, high agency. Um,
Hmm.
and I feel like in a way, I don't know, I may be a little bit off base saying this, but like, when you first start your career, you're coming out of school, um, whatever, program you graduate from. I feel like at school, at university, or at college, or whatever it is, there's a lot of pressure to go out and you know get a great grade and to try to execute on something perfectly or close to perfect, or to try to do something great, write an incredible paper and edit it 100 times over, or whatever it is. um, and the mentality at a startup is quite different. I really think it's a lot different, where it's more of a race to how quickly can you make a mistake so you can learn from that mistake and then and then move forward from there. You know what I mean? Obviously, you don't want to make mistakes, but it's inevitable. It's going to happen. So how quickly can you make it and learn from it and move on? Um, I don't know.
I love that. No, I think that's such a great way to put it. And I think those, I, I was just listening to this audiobook, and it was Tim Grover, who used to train Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. And he was saying the greats, it's all about, he said there's this saying that people have where it's, you get back, you get knocked down, and it's about how quickly you can get back up, which I think is like, there's truth to that. But what he added to that is, you got to get back up quick, but take that moment when you're down. He's like, take that extra moment to just reflect on, why I got knocked down, and what my opponent did, and what the reasons were, and just that extra moment. He's like, he says, like, that's one of the key differences that sets people apart is being able to have that kind of self-reflection piece. And that really resonated with me.
Love it. Re- Reflecting on your experience, with WonderFi and or other ventures that you've been a part of,
Mhm.
what would you say are the most valuable lessons you've learned, um, about team building in the startup ecosystem?
Mhm. I think that WonderFi came together so quickly because it was basically all of these relationships that I had built throughout my career kind of coming together to help to bring this to life, whether it was as co-founders or investors or customers and or advisors and things like that, board members. So I guess my probably one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that relationships really are everything. And I think that it can be so easy to be transactional, and not being transactional really pays off. And I feel like, I the first time that we met, that was something that really stood out to me about you was, this guy's not asking me for anything. He's saying, "How can I help you?" And also just wanting to genuinely connect. And so I think that those types of the more I feel like this is probably the same for you, not to put words in your mouth, but the more that I've moved towards just working with those people that I want to work with that are not transactional, the more that when I do come across someone that's transactional, I'm just like, no way. Like my body says no. I'm like, no, I'm not doing this. And so I think that what I think that's a big thing. And I also think that the more that I've moved into working with those types of people, the more that I see, oh damn, these people can also be super successful. And it's not. I kind of came up through a system with the mentality that you need to be cutthroat, and that's the way that you find success. And so I've seen probably completely the opposite.
Yeah, I think. Um, and by the way, you were reciprocating it back. You were saying to me, "How can I help?" But and I think that when if your viewpoint is long, and if you can look,
Mm-hmm.
everybody wants to win fast,
Mm-hmm.
and if you can do it, so be it. That's
Mm-hmm.
great. You know what I mean? Um, Not taking anything away from anybody who builds a company, has an incredible exit in 18 months, and they're
Mm-hmm.
laughing. But
Mm-hmm.
how do you build a great career or a great business, or um, how do you end up on where you want to end up over
Mm-hmm.
30 years? You know what I mean? And really, at the end of the day, I mean, obviously, there's so much innovation and technology, but at the end of the day, it's with the people that you surround yourself with. Karia, in the digital assets and blockchain space, the landscape is constantly evolving, and it can evolve really quickly. In a very short notice. How do you decide whether to follow existing playbooks or kind of chart your own course?
I think a lot of people get stuck on trying to do something brand new that nobody's doing. And that's getting harder and harder just in general. But especially if you look into something like the digital asset space, there's just so much innovation. So finding something that hasn't been done it's getting harder and harder. And so I would sort of position it more to say, looking at, as a founder, really looking at what you want to bring to life and something that you care about and have a high level of conviction about. And I think that you as a founder really need to let your personality and your traits kind of shine through in that. It's what I feel makes your business unique is that that personal aspect to it. And I think a, a pattern that happens quite often is people will try to live out someone else's values or ideals or goals in terms of what they're creating. And I honestly think that is often like selling yourself short. So to me, it's really just kind of tapping into that inspiration of like what you want to bring to life. And so in the context of the digital asset space, I think anyone that I've talked to who's new to the space or has been in it for 10 plus years, they have certain areas that they gravitate towards. Some people love NFTs and some people love stable coins. And sometimes I'll talk to people and we'll talk about stable coins and they'll be like, that's so, effing boring. I can't even, why are we even talking about that? And so I think following those types of signals is really what best serves founders.
It's kind of going back to following your passion, following back to who you are, your core values, your personality. Um, that's great. And if you think about your journey, is there an instance where maybe you had to deviate from the conventional playbook to get to where you are? Does something come to mind?
Yeah, I feel like my career is just a constant repetition of building up in a certain area and then walking away from it to do something new. And then also being told like, hey, you're throwing your career away, why are you leaving us behind? And I think that it's definitely a an intuition thing. And I think that it's one of those muscles, that trust and intuition muscle, that is extremely valuable and can be hard, especially early in your career. I think it can be hard to build that because you're so focused on trying to become an expert, trying to understand the landscape and all of those things. But I think the the those those I'll call them like EQ muscles are just as important as those IQ muscles. And I think that's evidenced by seeing some of the smartest people really getting stuck on like getting stuck on certain things, and then seeing people that aren't necessarily as smart in a conventional sense really finding that success. So I think being able to, I think that's key, and that's something that I've found has served me really well, and I don't listen to those people anymore. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you know, I was just asking you about where have you maybe deviated from the
Mm-hmm.
conventional playbook as it relates to your career or to the
Mm-hmm.
digital assets place, the digital assets space. But I think, um, you, and I'll let you speak to this,
Mm-hmm.
but you recently changed your name,
Mm-hmm.
and which is unconventional, um, in keeping with you and your career and everything that you've done and making bold decisions and everything else. Can you
Mm-hmm.
fill me in on what happened?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that was definitely a long time in the making. So going back to my days working at a big law firm, I just became obsessed with tracing my ancestry and figuring out where we came from. And that's really all that I knew at that time, because we didn't have like great records and not a lot of family around to be able to tell that history. So I was obsessed with it. Like I was working, I would be at the firm working until 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and then I would come home and literally stay up all night doing research and trying to figure out how I can put these pieces together to figure out where we came from. And I would do that multiple times a week. And I started to, after sort of a year or so, I started to get some traction. And through the last 10 years, really, through the internet and then traveling, to multiple continents, have pieced together a bit more of what my history is. Um, and so a lot of that was coming to grips with colonization and how that's impacted my family. and one piece of that was my name Ben, which I was named after big. I was born in London, England, and uh, I was named after Big Ben, which was a literal, you know, not a literal, a symbol of Britain's power over its colonies. And that for me, being someone with roots in the Caribbean, just didn't sync up anymore. And so I changed my name to Karia, which is a family name that was lost through kind of this forced movement across the world, in the last 100 years. So it was something that was super meaningful to me, and was nice to be able to reclaim that.
When you look back at your career, whether as an entrepreneur or an executive or your advisory roles, and your passion for eradicating modern slavery, how
Mm.
have these experiences shaped your approach to entrepreneurship?
I'd say I've been talking a lot about tapping into, who I am and how that's so important for entrepreneurs. But a piece that I haven't spoken to is how important it's been for me to have mentors and people that I've been really fortunate to be around, that have built things from the ground up, and built some companies that I really admire. And so I think when I reflect on that, looking back on my career, as you say, that's a really big piece, because I talked about speed and how that's part of my DNA, and I think that is true. I think I have that in my nature. But when I think back to the first time that I was working with the with a mentor who I was just seeing grow and scale a company, that was a trait that he had, and I really saw how effective that was and just emulated that. And then this the story continues as I got to be around more and more people that had a lot more experience than I did, and had grown companies a lot bigger than I had.
And as I guess another question that comes to my mind is, how do you balance the urge to innovate, which clearly is in your DNA? You're a creative thinker, you want to push the envelope, but with the practicalities, and you coming from the digital asset space, and this is a big thing, the
Mm-hmm.
practicalities of market and regulatory constraints, which I assume you've run into that wall numerous times. How do you balance that?
Yeah, are the regulators going to be listening to this podcast? Because I'm just kidding. Um, I feel like probably one of the most valuable things that I've done in my life, not just career but life, has been, and not to dump on lawyers, but really untraining myself from that lawyer mentality of looking for all the risks and looking for everything that can go wrong. Because I think that as valuable as a skill as that can be in the right context, I think it really hinders so much opportunity, and really, again, goes back to sort of killing things early. And I think that innovation, just especially with the rate at which things are being innovated today, if you have those if you have those constraints in mind, it's gonna really, I feel like it just creates so much, it limits things so much, because things can really evolve and find their way to fit into the market or within regulatory constraints, but they can only do that if they have a little bit of room to breathe. And so I think that's sort of how I look at that. And I guess one other thing I would add to that is the I feel like I just sound like I'm complaining now, but I think there's this feeling I think that people get, where pointing out flaws in something, or pointing out like, oh, you're going to have regulatory issues with this, or oh, the market's not going to be ready for this, or oh, this, it really makes people feel smart and like there's value that they're adding. But in the context of innovation, I actually just don't, I don't think that's true. And as a founder, or as an entrepreneur in in a larger business, or whatever it is, I think I've seen this time and time again, and I think a lot of people can attest to it, is that you really just need one person to believe in you or in your idea, and that can change everything.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky balance, right? I mean, regulation is necessary. I mean,
Mhm.
you need certain guardrails, but it can also crush innovation. And innovation, when done right and when pushed in the right direction, can
Mhm.
have huge positive implications for society and negative. And I guess supposedly, that's where regulation comes in, but very tricky balance. And
Yeah.
you managed to navigate that tightrope. Um, that's great, Karia. Um, Karia, in this conversation, we talked a fair bit about transitions throughout someone's career. Is there any advice you have um, for folks out there who are thinking about transitioning or are transitioning from one job to another or one company
Mhm.
to starting another? What advice would you have for them?
So I have a few questions that I always ask myself in these transition periods. The first gating piece of advice is just be patient, and I think we can put so much pressure on ourselves, again, to find that right next thing, or just to land into something. And I think being able to alleviate some of that pressure allows for some of the best opportunities to come up. Um, but questions I always ask myself: what gets me excited? What brings my energy up? And probably the moving into harder questions: what do I want to do next? And I think that question, often people, you might not have an answer for that, but I think another way to frame that would be, if there were no limits, what would I be doing? If I didn't have any limits on where I lived, or what my skill set was, or what my connections were, or any of these things, like what would I be doing? And not just in a career, but like, what would I be doing in my life? And I think that question can open up a lot of interesting responses. And then the last question that I ask, which is one that I don't always have answers to, and I think is a really hard one, is when you know what you want to do next, or what you want out of your next thing, asking, why do I want that? And I think that can lead to some really interesting conversations with yourself.